Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion. Now, tonight's discussion is on a current topic, a controversial topic, and an uncomfortable topic. The topic of Confederate monuments, which, of course, this is something people have been talking about for a long time, especially since 2015, with the Charleston shootings, the Charlottesville rally a year ago, and then now, much more recently, earlier this week at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a Confederate monument known as Silent Sam, a monument to Confederate soldiers who served in the Civil War, who had attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was torn down by a group of protesters. Of course, this sparks a discussion and really brings to light the sort of polarization we have in this country when it comes to people's attitudes about the Civil War and how they should be remembered. Now, of course, I've said before, I'm a descendant of Confederate veterans, but it's good sometimes to, I'm proud of their service, but, I think that it's good that when we see things have gotten to this point, it's time to have a discussion about how we should remember the Civil War, the Confederate veteran. Should that be distinct from the Confederacy as an institution? What about the monuments, and how does this impact our classrooms? And in return, how do our classrooms affect society, and what is really our role as teachers, when looking at a topic like this? Of course, you can tweet at us if you'll tweet at me at Tom Richey and then Mr. Whitehouse EDU with the Teach Sam hashtag. The hashtag is Teach Sam if y'all want to use that. And my guest here this evening is Mr. Parker Whitehouse, a U.S. history teacher who's actually teaching in Chapel Hill. So this is very timely, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with him. Parker, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Yeah. So this is actually, I've only been in Chapel Hill for a little bit over a year, so I can't claim to be a native Chapel Hillian. I'm from Kentucky originally. I spent most of my life there, University of Kentucky alum. I taught in Louisville, Kentucky for about 3 years before moving here last year with my wife. She's a resident of the University of North Carolina now. And so I've been teaching for this last year and about to start. North Carolina starts so much later than the rest of the country, but we're starting next week for my second year teaching American history at Chapel Hill High School. I'm excited to be here.
All right. And, and the other thing, Parker, that I was mentioning, because I think point of view matters. And this is something when I'm teaching the Civil War, it's like I've got my, Robert E. Lee mug here. And, it is well that war is so terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it. And I tell people, look, it's like where I come from matters, and the way that I view these things. Mr. Lico's watching, from up in Connecticut, much different viewpoint on these things. And you said you're from Kentucky. Now, Kentucky was a border state. What was your experience with the Civil War growing up?
Experience with it. Kentucky was always one of those states that when you're talking about the history of it, it's interesting because it was a border state, right? And so when you hear that phrase, the Civil War, brother against brother, I think it takes on a lot more reality in a state like Kentucky because a lot of people, really, including my family, has a heritage on both sides. Right? We have people that fought in the Confederacy, people that fought or fought for the Union as well. And so, because it was a border state, it's mixed, right? And I think a lot looking at Kentucky history, really ever since the Civil War, it has sided and continues probably to feel and more like a Southern state, or as if it had been in the Confederacy more so than in the Union. But historically, looking specifically at that Civil War era, I think it's both. Right? I think that's one of the neatest part about studying the Civil War in Kentucky was that it had a lot of gravity or weight to it because we had, a lot of us had family heritage from both the Union and Confederacy.
Okay, and that's of course very very interesting because I've had similar discussions. I appreciate Miss Z telling her students about this, and talked about like she told me she had relatives on both sides. It's like me being a native of Louisiana, I don't know any
Yeah.
relative, any ancestor of mine that fought for the Union. It's like my roots go all the way back to Jamestown and have been in the South ever since. Now, at the same time, I do want to make clear very early on, this is not, I'm not going to tell somebody, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, or any kind of like, apologetics for, the Confederate government or secession or anything like that. My chief concern being the, just the memory of the rank and file Confederate veteran. Now, Parker, let me go ahead and try to play this video, okay? Because some people watching may not have seen, what we've got there. And I want to look at this video of these protesters who were, who took down the Silent Sam Memorial. Now, Silent Sam was a Confederate soldier monument that was put there in 1913. So it's been there for about 105 years or so. And let me go ahead and play this here. Now, just to be clear, and Mr. Lico and I had this discussion, there are a few kinds of Confederate monuments. There's one, you can go to the Texas State House and see a very massive monument to the Confederacy with Jefferson Davis on top of it, and, memorializing these people who fought for states' rights and, all of that stuff. This one is a monument with a simple soldier on top. It's nighttime. It's going to be a little bit difficult to see this, but we're going to see if this actually will play. Those of you in the chat room, let me know if you're getting this. Now, also, if you're watching at tomrichey.net/APUSH, I've put a link here. I've put a link on that page, so if this doesn't really come through very well, then you can see it there. But let me go ahead and play this video. And let's see what we think. Okay, now Parker,
Yeah.
level of discomfort watching that video, 0 being completely comfortable, 10 just
Right.
a completely traumatic experience. What are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, I think there aren't a whole lot of people. I think they're going to look at that and be like, "Oh yeah, I'm totally comfortable and watching that." So I think, yeah, of course. I think looking at that, I'd say, I don't know, 6, 7 on a discomfort scale. Mostly because it's not something. It's not something that I would have wanted to be right in the middle of in the fray. Right. And I think that there's different levels to this in thinking about the action that was taken versus the outcome, right? Like thinking about the actual outcome of this is one thing, and you can celebrate the removal of the statue. And I think what we're doing here is the second part of that, which is a dialogue about how it came down.
Okay, and so as far as that, now for me, I mean, yeah, I'd say like and at least about an 8 maybe, just because it's just to me, I felt like I was watching like the Passion of the Christ again. I mean, it's just it's and the same thing happened in the Durham video. It's
Right.
not just the just the removal of the statue, but the abuse of the statue, the kicking, the spitting, and there was a blog that I was reading that, the gentleman said Silent Sam didn't feel anything when that stuff happened, but at the same time, I'm thinking, these people are feeling something that is visceral toward this symbol. Now, of course, when I look at it, I look at this as a soldier's monument. This is commemorating 1,800 UNC students who fought in the Confederate Army, 500 of whom died. 500 UNC students died in the Civil War. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy spent 4 years to come up with the equivalent of today, I think, about $180,000 to erect this monument. I look at this, I don't understand the hatred. Now, Parker, when you and I were talking on Twitter, you seem to have, kind of a connection with at least what was felt by the people there as you perceive it. Why don't we hear a little about that?
Yeah. So I guess in looking at what you said is like the visceral anger there. I think what jumps out at me the most is there's the classic Martin Luther King quote, that a riot is the voice of the unheard, and that it's our responsibility to look at a riot and question, not just like, oh my gosh, what happened? Like, why are they so angry? But really ask ourselves, what are the conditions that led to this? Right? What conditions led us to a point where people would be so frustrated? And it's our responsibility to think about, if a group that large, and it's not just those people there, that group, I'm sure, of people that would have supported those actions is even larger. It's our responsibility to think about, what is it that infuriated those people so much? And I think that this also leads us back to that document that we were sending back and forth of Julian Carr, right? And, industrialist, philanthropist in the area, but also, a noted white supremacist, KKK supporter, the individual who dedicated the statue of Silent Sam. And it really wasn't, there had always been, right, Confederate statues, really over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there has been some level of dissension around them. But Silent Sam specifically really started to become a heated debate when, I believe it was, I can't remember what his name was, but one of the UNC professors dug up and found the dedication speech from Julian Carr, which made it abundantly clear that his perspective on Silent Sam and on this dedication was as a monument to what the Confederacy stood for. Right? Let me see if I can find that actual piece.
Well, let me do that. And this is something, you've mentioned the Julian Carr document, which I think is important, and I think we should discuss this. Because this, a couple days ago, somebody was like, and this is one of those things, kind of like after Charlottesville, everybody on Twitter that wanted to argue with me, it seemed like nearly all of them shared the same article with me from the Atlantic. So there was this person who wrote an article in the Atlantic, basically a smear piece about Robert E. Lee, and everyone is cutting and pasting the same article. And this has turned into that, where it's just, oh, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And what's happened, and I forget the gentleman's name as well, but right now he's a professor at the College of Charleston, but he was a graduate student at UNC, and he found this speech. Now, he wrote a letter to the editor of the Tar Heel where he quoted this speech. Now here's the thing that I want to get into. Now, we need to go ahead and share the content of this. This is available at tomrichey.net/APUSH. Right under the video, I've got a link where you can download the Julian Carr speech. Okay, so that is accessible here at tomrichey.net/APUSH. And because this does need to be addressed, and I think that I've made it clear in other work of mine that to pretend that there were no there was no racism associated with the Confederacy, I don't think that really helps anyone. Now what I would say, Parker, is the only part of this speech. Now, I've got 6 pages here. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
of the dedication of this speech. And my issue here, and this is really where for me it goes into, how is it that we're teaching students to understand history? And by we, I just mean socially, because I'm, not in anybody's classroom in particular, but this is about half a page in the middle of it, about 1/12 of the speech, but it's the only part anybody seems to care about, which when we talk about politics now, in AP government, which Parker, I think you and I both taught, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's gotten to where, the sound bites, when you go back to the 60s and the 70s, they'd actually have like clips of like the president speaking maybe for a minute or two. And now it's all about 15-second sound bites, 140 or 280 character tweets,
Right.
and stuff like that. And so let's go ahead and put this out there. Okay. So he says here, in the middle of this dedication, this is what people have been circulating around social media. The present generation, I'm persuaded, scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war, when the facts are that their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South, when the bottom rail was on top all over the southern states, of course, referring to Reconstruction. And today, as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states. Praise God. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit it is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings, where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head.
Can I ask you a question?
Well, yeah, you're certainly welcome to ask another one. Yeah. So yeah, please, like, let's discuss what we just read.
Yeah. You said that that's the only soundbite. After reading that, because I've read through the rest of the speech, just kind of looking if there's anything else. Does the rest of it matter? Right. With a soundbite that visceral, is that disqualifying for anything else? Right. Does it matter what else is in that speech?
Well, I would contend that it does, like, for a couple reasons. Okay, so the thing is, I mean, we know one perspective that it shouldn't matter, and maybe we can talk about why it shouldn't as well. But the thing is, there are a couple of things I want to note here. Now, the one thing that I think is important is that this was not Julian Carr's statue. I mean, if I'm thinking about one of the season finales of The Office where Michael Scott asked Toby, who do you think you are? What gives you the right? What gives this guy the right to be the face of Silent Sam? I posted a video on my channel, the other day, about Harry Miller, a UNC student who's buried, who died in battle in 1864, who's buried in Pendleton, South Carolina. And what gives Julian Carr the right to personify this statue that is observing the deaths of these 500 Confederate soldiers and the service of 1,300 more? So that's for one thing. I would say that, what gives him the right to determine? Because, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, it took the United Daughters of the Confederacy 4 years to come up with the money. So it wasn't like there's just one large donor. I mean, this wasn't like the Hillary Clinton campaign. This was the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, the way that I see this, I mean, this is a lot of small donations and a lot of people donating for what they believe is, to have a memorial for their sons, for their fathers, for their brothers, some who came back, some who didn't. And I feel like this guy, what gives him the right to put his face on the statue rather than those 500 veterans? And another thing I would note here is, he's saying here, let's see. So I just had, okay. So, and he says here, I trust I may be pardoned for one illusion, howbeit it is rather personal. So he's asking the pardon of the audience to basically go off on a tangent. And then when we look at this other portion, the present generation, I'm persuaded, scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race. And the thing is, it reads to me, like not even going to the rest of the speech, but it reads to me like this guy in the second half of his speech is pontificating. You know, he's the local rich guy. And let's give everybody the full context. And you've got some additional context to offer. There's a building named after this guy at Duke University. This is, and this is the other thing that I think most people don't know that are circulating this thing, that this guy donated the land that Duke University sits on. Okay, so it's like, I mean, if we're really going to declare war on the legacy of Julian Carr, let's move Duke University. Let's rename the building that's named after him. Now, where else do you know? In Chapel Hill, you said so. This is the thing. Let's talk about who this guy was.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Chapel Hill is directly connected to the town of Carrboro. Ironically enough, a little small, like more or less hippie commune connected to Chapel Hill, but it's named for Julian Carr. But it is there have been plenty of people in Carrboro that have motioned and attempted to try to change the name because of that legacy. He had multiple schools named after him in Durham County. I know recently in the last 5 or 6 years, several there was one middle school and one elementary school that their boards came together and made a decision to change their name in the interest of their students not having to walk into a school every day, of even as, yes, someone that's an industrialist, a philanthropist, but also a white supremacist. And that legacy is something that students have to deal with too when they're walking through that. And I think that same thing kind of also comes back to the statue, right? That having to walk past that. And I think ultimately what we're talking about here is what that statue means, right? Like you contend that more or less the statue stands for and represents those people that chose to fight and die for the Confederate cause. They gave their lives for that. And you contend that it's giving honor to that. And I think that Silent Sam and a lot of those statues, yes, a lot of them probably were intended to give honor to those that fought and died for the cause. But if that is even the entire purpose of it, right? Even if the entire purpose is to give honor to those that fought and died, I think the statement of that it makes by still being there in our public spaces of what those people were fighting for is important. Right? Those students that left UNC to fight, they were fighting for the Confederacy, and that matters. Right? It matters that they chose to fight for the U.S. Confederacy. And you said at this beginning, right, you're not going to challenge the fact that the Confederacy was founded around the institution of slavery.
No, wait. Let me clarify that. Okay. Now, first of all, let me, since I wasn't going to interrupt you earlier, but let's remember the draftees. Okay. Because like Jesse Richey may have been a draftee. My 3X great grandfather might have been drafted. We're not sure, but he was like in his 40s. So we're like, why did he vote? He might have been drafted. There are some of them that were. Now, let me just make sure I'm being understood correctly. Like, I think that the neo-Confederate reactionary sort of history where it's like the Civil War was not about slavery, I think that that's something that, you're not getting anywhere trying to argue that, okay, because it's not going to be able to be supported by evidence. Yeah. But neither am I going to say that the Confederate States of America was founded exclusively on slavery, that the Confederate soldier, was fighting consciously, for the preservation of, slavery as a first order of business. I mean, this, we're talking about somebody who, they're being told like there's an invading army coming in, and this army, Parker, let's be real. I mean, and there's a book, I forget the name of it, but I mean, it's published by a Yale professor. I mean, this Union Army raped, and most of the rape victims were African-American women. This army is raping, this army is burning, this army is stealing. And, we're going to say that someone was dishonorable for putting down their books and picking up a gun and saying that I'm not going to, to just sit here and tolerate this, and we're going to throw dishonor on somebody for that.
That's
I mean, that's the way. Okay, so just to make sure my perspective.
Let me clarify on that. Right. So again, I think that what we have to do here is think about this not so much on the personal level, right? Instead of thinking about this as this individual Confederate soldier, right? This represents these 4 or 5 people, right? That may have took the they made the hundreds of UNC students, or even any statue, right? Any Confederate statue that represents an individual that chose to fight for the Confederacy, right? We're not so much discussing the individual quality of that individual person's character, right? What we're thinking about here is the harm done by putting up a monument to anyone that fought for the cause of the Confederacy, right? In fighting for the cause of the Confederacy, even if you as an individual, right, may have been drafted in, right? That more or less makes a clear statement that we are siding with the values of those people, right? It's putting that on display in our public places. Right? And the people have to walk past Silent Sam every day. And I think a lot of people aren't walking past that thinking of those 400 or 500 individuals that passed away fighting in the war. What they're thinking is the Confederacy, especially when we're thinking about people of color. Right? When we're thinking about students, about professors, about people in Chapel Hill that walk past that and think, the Confederacy was founded for the purpose of continuing and extending slavery. Right? It was founded as a reason, more or less. You can read in every single secession document that's the purpose of the reason that they broke away in the first place and why they were fighting that war. So the war, even if it was,
I think every is a strong word. See, now this is where we get into like the nuances, because it's like Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina. North Carolina was a state that did not initially secede from the Union. They seceded after Fort Sumter. After you've got this the attack on Fort Sumter, then Lincoln calls for troops, but you've got Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, that these states, there were people who were, these states were going to stay in the Union, and they had other reasons for leaving besides the institution of slavery. Now, I'll grant you, I mean, to say that slavery is just a non-issue here, or not even a major issue and not even the most important issue, would be counterproductive. But then again, and I think that's where, and I think this is the profit of this discussion, is when we're thinking about the American Civil War, can we assign a single motive to the Confederacy? And I think that's a judgment call that people make. And I think because of that judgment call, now I certainly can, empathize with somebody who is uncomfortable looking at a monument. My answer would be, why can't we build more monuments rather than, take one down? I also want to say that if there were an arrangement where Silent Sam could have been moved or could be moved, because I believe North Carolina law mandates that it be put back within 90 days, but where it could be moved somewhere where it's less offensive, I mean, I'd have no problem with that at all. I mean, I think that if that would lessen the chance of something like that happening, but then I almost wonder, I mean, if, people, because it happened in Durham sometime, in the fall, I believe. Do you know if that statue has ever been put back up, or
not to the best of my knowledge? Yeah. Okay.
And so, and then you've got this, what happens when a mob, and really not that, they said about 250 people were there total. I think to say that all 250 were involved in tearing down the statue would be, that wouldn't be really, possible really, but it's a small group of people when we're thinking about a campus of 28,000 people. Right. So what happens when we start moving these monuments in response to an act of vandalism? I mean, that would be one concern of mine. But in the abstract, before we went live, I was talking about what's happening in Lexington, Kentucky, where, General John Hunt Morgan and Vice President, Breckinridge, their statues are being moved somewhere, respectful, like to a cemetery. And I think that's great. And I think that's actually the only way the question's ever asked, where a majority of the American people support the removal of Confederate memorials if they're told that it's going to be put somewhere where it's going to be treated with respect.
Right. And I think that's the crux of this argument. And I almost think it's a different, it's kind of a different piece than what we're talking about here, right? To discuss what we should do with them, right? Because it really does. It all comes down to this, like, really, and this is what we were kind of talking about on Twitter, which is, what are these statues really? And right now, in its kind of centerpiece position on UNC's campus, right, in so many places across the nation. You mentioned the Daughters of the Confederacy. I mean, they built hundreds of these statues across the South, and they made sure to put these in very prevalent places, right? Not just Silent Sam, but they were the centerpiece of, courthouses, of public spaces. And that public nature is vital to this conversation, right? It's a totally different conversation, I would say, or almost a tangent off the conversation to talk about whether or not we should move them. Because I agree, so many people would be much more interested in that, in placing them into some form of museum, or placing them in a Confederate or some form of Confederate monument garden, or somewhere away from the public space. Because in many ways, what we put in our public space, it sends a message, right? It tells people what we value. And it's important for us to make sure that our public spaces represent who we are as a nation. And having a Confederate statue there sends so many difficult messages, even if it purely intended and it has been misconstrued at some point to say that it was representing and should be honoring the people who died in the war, right? A lot of these, I would disagree. I don't really think that's the purpose of what a lot of these statues were for. But this conversation is more on what to do with them. And I think the most important part there is that difference between public and private space, or public space that all people enjoy versus cemeteries, right? Or museums, treating them instead of monuments as artifacts, right? They're things that we should be looking at as a relic of a bygone era, of something else that happened a long time ago, and that it should be sparking discussions. It shouldn't be the fountain in the centerpiece of our hometown that we will have to walk past every single day and remind us of, man, we had some dark times 150 years ago. Right? It shouldn't be there to remind our people of that. We have textbooks for that. We have museums for that. We have so many other spaces that we can use for that, and not these main public byways.
Now, by that standard, I guess, what's going to happen? I mean, because I always tell people, just be ready. 200 years from now, people are going to look back at us, and there's going to be something that we see as totally normal, that we're going to be told that, they're going to think that we were just flat out evil for doing whatever we think of as just completely normal. And maybe, we're just starting to hear about, cell phone addictions becoming a big thing. These people carry these devices in their hands and that sort of thing. Who knows what people are going to say about us? But by that standard, do we do we reshuffle stuff around like every time, values change? Because, this is a pretty expensive undertaking. I forget the total price tag of those New Orleans removals, and they didn't even properly put those monuments back up somewhere else. If you're really going to do this right, and that's what I'm wondering here is, do we not need to be reminded about the Civil War? To me, when I look at a monument like this, you look at this war that, took the lives of over 500,000 Americans. And should we not be reminded about that? And especially in the atmosphere of political polarization that we're seeing here, because, you look at, and another thing that concerns me is, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, these were, this is part of the history of American women. It's like these women really took the initiative and, put these monuments up and, raise the money and all that. And now it's just, you just erase that. Now, given I'm not going to say that I think that, this thing needs to be in the quad where everybody can see it. I think that's, at a certain point, people have got to come together and think like, maybe Silent Sam needs to be, somewhere where people, maybe where everybody's not walking by, or maybe should be in a cemetery or something like that. But at the same time, I think there still is a, like when we look at Julian Carr's speech, for example, and when I looked at what this gentleman who was a grad student at the time at UNC, he didn't share the entire speech. I mean, you've got this half a page, but then you've got 5.5 pages that are talking about, the valor of these, Confederate veterans. And I think, and of course I see on Twitter where somebody's telling me, oh, are you proud of secession? Da, 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 da. And it's like, no, I mean, I think that now I tend to distinguish between a Confederate monument that's a monument to the Confederacy as an institution or a Confederate leader. And then there is just this common, Confederate soldier like Harry Miller, who I think about like, man, like, I mean, this guy, had a real, I mean, when I heard about Silent Sam, I immediately thought about this guy whose grave I'd seen, who was a student at Chapel Hill. And I wonder, Parker, one thing that's got me, we can look back, and see periods where there was reconciliation, between the North and the South over the Civil War. Julian Carr noted that he went up to Princeton. There were Princeton and Harvard students that left their university to fight in the war. And Princeton, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, awarded honorary degrees to people who'd left the school to serve in the Confederate Army. And everybody had this feeling of mutual understanding. Now, of course, since then we've had the civil rights movement, and we've got a more multiracial society. I wonder, it's like, of course, our understanding of the Civil War needs to change and be more inclusive, but must somebody's history be squashed in order for, must someone's like memory be completely silenced in order to have a more inclusive vision? I mean, it seems a bit paradoxical to me.
But do you really think that that's what's happening, right? And I think a lot of it is that it feels like that because there is such a prevalence of this history throughout the South, right? And there are so many Confederate statues, which is unlike anything any other country in the world has ever done, to have thrown up hundreds and hundreds of statues to the men who more or less rebelled against their home country and attempted to create their own nation, created a war that led to hundreds of thousands of millions of deaths. No other nation in the world has done that. And there is so much history in that right now. Taking away some statues isn't going to do it. That isn't going to quash the history. And two, more people have studied the Civil War than just about any point in American history. Maybe World War II or the Revolution or comparative to that. The history of the Civil War, it's not going anywhere. And I can't see how a statue is going to do that.
I want to take issue with that though, Parker, because it's like, when I was growing up, now I guess I'm 38. I think you're a little younger than I am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, when I was growing up, of course, I grew up watching the Dukes of Hazzard, and the General Lee and all that kind of stuff. But, the Civil War wasn't really, it was something people liked to talk about. It was part, it was a cultural kind of thing. It's gotten to where people really don't discuss it anymore. It's like, really, even though when we poll people, the majority of Americans don't support, extreme, actions against Confederate monuments, people are afraid to talk about it. And it's only been, with this Silent Sam thing, I'm thinking, I really need to, put my voice out there, because I think a lot of people have been intimidated, and then the other thing is that if the Civil War was only about slavery, open and shut case, anybody who tries to add any kind of nuance to it, anybody who says that, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are my heroes, they can't say this without being labeled a racist or having some other stigma attached to them. I don't really see a future where people see the American Civil War as something that's worthy of further study, as something they would enjoy studying and talking about and delving into, because it's just gotten to be so toxic. I mean, it's just the topic has become so toxic that I think that once this older generation moves on that has been fascinated with the Civil War, I think that we are, I mean, this is just my premonition that I think that we're going to see, like, you know, less of an interest in studying the American Civil War, because everybody thinks, oh, I read this one little document and I've got the whole thing figured out. Let's move on to something else because this is worthy of further study. That's my concern. What do you have to say to that?
So see, I almost take the exact opposite take on it. The Civil War is maybe actually probably my favorite subject to teach. Mostly because I think it can absolutely fascinate students. And I think the old way of teaching it, right? That old way that that in many ways was, in some ways, another story for another day, was kind of built up by Southern heritage, Daughters of the Confederacy. But you know, the old way of teaching it, which is like, let's go through the battles, let's go through what caused the Civil War, let's go through Reconstruction, as just event after event after event. That, you know, that interests people mostly from a more military perspective as much as anything. But what I've found absolutely fascinates my students is the historiography of it, right? The concerted, the efforts of Southerners to restructure and recreate their own history, and taking a look not at what our textbook says or what even older textbooks say, and taking a look specifically at, you know, the primary source documents, looking at our sources, and thinking about those narratives that we've always heard, right? You know, no, there are very few textbooks or anything that talk about, you know, slaves' roles in freeing themselves, right? We get this overarching narrative, you know, Lincoln as the great emancipator, and no one ever talks about all these other things that happened. And so when we start to talk about what this idea of the lost cause is, or you know, the idea of the genteel South, and how it is that people kind of restructured and recreated what it means, or what the purpose of the Civil War is, or why it was that so many people for so long, you know, it's what 45% of Americans still believe that the Civil War was primarily about states' rights, right? That first and foremost, that was the main cause of the Civil War. And that's a great question for our students. It is one of my favorite weeks of class, is like, what was the primary purpose of the Civil War? And let the students kind of deal with that themselves and work through it. And more or less, I don't have to give them the answer to that. The sources tell the story. And if we,
well, now the sources that you select tell the story. I mean, that's what concerns me, is the, you know, it's really that it's the sources that are being chosen to be emphasized. So the thing is, it's like somebody says, oh, well, let's look at the Mississippi Secession Declaration. Okay. But let's not look at, you know, the congressional, you know, the resolution of the United States Congress in 1861 that said that this war is not about slavery, you know, just verbatim. I mean, you know, and the thing is that we get into, you know, it's, I mean, that's what's really getting to me, is that a lot of times it's, okay, let's look at this primary source, but it's a primary source that is directing a student in a certain way to try to lead them to a certain conclusion, you know, and not that that's, you know, always the case. And I'm not sure which ones, you know, you're using, but I think that there is a lot, like, it's almost like, you know, Christians arguing over the Bible, where depending on what you want to look at or what you want to get out and cut and paste, then you can tell whatever story you want. You know, I mean, I personally, I think that the, you know, the binary interpretation of the Civil War, like, it has to be about slavery, it has to be about states' rights, when, you know, if we really just were to throw the documents on the floor and pick them up at random instead of choosing the ones that people would prefer to look at, then we're going to get a more complex picture of this that I think is going to be a lot less infuriating to people who are having extreme perspectives pushed on them. I mean, the thing is, just my experience, Parker, and I'm enjoying this conversation with you, by the way, but, you know, I've talked to other people that teach U.S. history who have just, they have just said point blank, like, any, you know, like, hey, I try to do multiple perspectives when I teach everything else, but not the Civil War. You know, it's just the idea of looking at a Confederate perspective and at least trying, you know, even if you don't agree with it, but just, hey, you know, let's see where this guy's coming from, or something like that. I'm not really seeing that, like, just outside of, just a handful of classrooms. I'm not. I mean, that's my critique of the current state of things. That I don't see an open dialogue about this subject.
So I guess what I would come back to in that, there's a ed professor, Diana Hess, that writes about controversial topics in the classroom. And this really hits on her big idea, which is the difference between open conversations or open topics and closed topics. And this is one of those where I personally see it, and I think a lot of historians probably see this more as a closed conversation. I think that it's history. There is no binary history. That's tell my students that on day 1 and 2 and every single day. Nothing is black and white in history. It's all a shade of gray. But in the end, I see very little real value as a society in looking at this and saying, maybe it wasn't about slavery. There's so many things pointing towards that. And so ultimately what I do as a history teacher is I let my students make that decision without me. I have them look through the documents. I mean, this is weeks of secession documents and, everything from Missouri Compromise up through the Compromise of 18, all the whole shebang. And then, we full Socratic seminar thinking about what it was that caused the Civil War. But then in the end, I do. This is a period. So what you said is more or less what I do once the students have kind of said what they believe based on the documents. I will tell them, like, this is one of those occasions where I'm going to give you my opinion. The Civil War was started. The Confederacy was founded. It was about slavery. And I think it's a disservice to a huge population in our country to say that it wasn't.
Now, see, but then that sort of contradicts some of the things here. And you use the word, I want to point out, Parker, this is where the college debater is going to come out. You use the word opinion. So even when you're talking about this, you use the word opinion that, if we have a philosophy of history, that history is something that is complex, that there are multiple perspectives, and then we make exceptions. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the only truly closed case, according to the American Historical Association, is the Holocaust, that the Holocaust happened. Okay. And that's not even an interpretive type of thing. And I think we would all agree that the Civil War happened. And I think this goes back to what we were saying, that really the idea of any history as being closed, I think, is a bit dangerous as far as the interpretive piece, not as far as the fact piece, like these Holocaust deniers. But if we look at the history of the historiography of the Civil War, so at first, the Southerners after the war, they're saying we fought for states' rights. The North, they fought for slavery. Then, of course, you've got this time where it was about tariffs. It was about states' rights. And really what we're seeing here is a trend. I mean, basically, the way that a lot of academic history works is you have to say something slightly new or slightly different than what everybody else is saying, but you can't say something too far out because you've got to rely. I mean, it's like basically the word that I want to use, I can't use in an educational forum, but there's a word I'm thinking about that would be perfect here. You can probably surmise that on your own, but it basically is. It's just these people sitting around patting each other on the back. And, it's like this guy that we mentioned that found this primary source. His book is called something like, his upcoming book is like The False Cause, Fraud, and Confederate Memory. This isn't something nobody said before. This is the same stuff that every other, person's been saying, like on the academic level for the past few years, because it's the current trend. And it's about making yourself known and saying whatever's trendy. Who's to say that people aren't going to change at a certain point? And I guess that goes, Parker, to what I'm thinking about. Is the current state of things right now sustainable? Can we really expect, like, just for this to keep going the way it is, where basically this seems to be, to me, a competition? It's not some kind of thing like we're trying to reach some sort of entente, you know, or come up with some kind of way that everybody can just move on and respect each other and some minor differences that people have. But it's really like this idea that this way of thinking must be defeated, and this way of thinking must be defeated through violence if necessary. So the thing is, you've got, you know, you said yourself, it's like the majority of Americans looking at the Civil War, you know, they tend to see it as, you know, about states' rights. I'm not saying that they're informed or anything like that. But at the same time, I think that if we look at any matter of historical interpretation as a strictly closed case, and especially when there's that's what gets to me here. That, okay, so it's a closed case, that the Civil War was, you know, just like absolutely about slavery and there were no other major factors here. But the majority of the population doesn't believe that. And so we're saying that it's a closed case before people have been persuaded. And so then I would ask, why aren't people being persuaded? You know, I mean, that, so I think that, you know, it's like, what good is it in looking at this as a closed case?
What good is it in looking at it as a closed case?
Right, rather than something being.
I can hit on a couple things that you were saying there. A lot of this is you asked about like what we're doing right now and kind of re-looking at this and trying to change the narrative. I don't think it's changing the narrative. I think it's actually getting history right. Right? It's going back and looking at, for instance, what the Daughters of the Confederacy did. Right, and what groups like that did throughout the South in rewriting textbooks, in making sure that every textbook that we published through every Southern state would tell the story of genteel plantations and slavery as this wonderful institution. It's things like that that created this narrative of the lost cause. That's what has created this 45+% of Americans that believe that. And when you flip that and look at PhDs in history, I want to say, I mean, it was like 96 to 98% would say slavery was the primary cause. And again, we're not arguing that it is a binary 100% slavery was the only cause, the only thing that matters. Nothing in history works like that. But it was the primary and far and away the thing that started the Civil War. And I think the reason that the things are getting so ugly is because we're addressing that finally, right? We're ripping off the Band-Aid. We're facing an ugly part of our history and the fact that there has been a concerted effort to cover it up. All right, that's the way I see this. And the way I think a lot of people see this. And I think that is something that is tough for this nation to deal with. But I think that it's important for all of us to move forward, right? So much of this issue right now, it bases itself in racial conflict. And if we continue to act like the Confederacy wasn't just about slavery and was also about these other issues, it's like that makes a clear statement, to people that don't look like us, right? That aren't white guys from the South. That makes a pretty clear statement to them where our values are, and the fact that, maybe we should talk about the merits of the Confederacy. We shouldn't talk about the merits of the Confederacy. It's a clear statement to people of color that the Confederacy wasn't all bad, even though they had these full attempts and absolute desires to enslave.
Well, now you say full intent and absolute. Like, there's a book that I've got. I don't know if I can find it immediately, but it's called The Gray and the Black. This is published in the 1970s. And this is about the Confederate emancipation efforts. Now, the thing is that we basically freeze Confederate history, like before the war starts. Like, there is not a single document from the Confederacy that tends to be in these source collections that's actually after the war started. And, looking at the complexity of how are these people addressing like what they see as their country being invaded, which I think is something that, this is a real belief that these people had. And, but the thing is, there was a discussion about emancipation, it was too little too late, but, how often do people see the document in, March of 1865, where the Confederate Congress finally authorizes the formation of black regiments, and, that there were people that were arguing for something to be done, what might have, but the thing is, I think a lot of times it's presented as a monolith. And part of the other thing is, what I refer to as the Nazification of the Confederacy, that often the Confederacy is like made to look even worse by comparing it to something else. That if Nazi Germany would have never happened, then what would happen to all these people on the internet that are just like, oh, you don't see the Germans putting up memorials to World War II soldiers? And it's like, look, it's not the same thing that,
So let's remove every, let's put a vacuum on it, right? It's like United States history. We've got the expanse of that. Tell me, I'm fascinated to hear what could you possibly tell me, right? What are the merits of the Confederacy? Because I don't know. I just don't think that I can look at my diverse group of students and tell them that there are multiple merits to the Confederacy. I think that's ingenuine, and I think it's unfair to them.
Okay, so I mean, and I'm not going to get into that kind of stuff with you because that's really it's like just because of somebody's demographics that, I can't tell the truth as I see it, but somebody else can tell the truth as they see it.
Okay, so
I think teachers have a responsibility to deal with things with responsibility and honesty. I mean, we can talk about people, of different backgrounds, but there are people who are, in your classroom that are descendants of Confederate veterans. I mean, what about them? And what about the way that they see themselves? I mean, as somebody who is a native Southerner, am I supposed to tell my daughter that her, now, of course, I mean, we're not debating the merits of slavery or anything like that. And to me, Silent Sam's not a monument to the Confederacy. It's a monument to the Confederate soldier. And so, when I say the merits of the Confederacy, now I would tell my students that, you might want to, at least think about, where is it that secession is clearly illegal? Why is it that although people like to refer to Confederates as traitors, why wasn't a single Confederate ever tried or convicted of treason? There are definitely some, no pun intended, some gray areas here. And, to say that, I have to say it this way. And really, I think that your way of looking at this has made things more divisive. And when we look at, history professors and PhDs and stuff like that, when I was working on a master's in history and I was thinking about going into a PhD program, I didn't end up going that route. But there was someone who really just snobbishly, just condescendingly told me good luck making it in academia as a conservative. Just straight up told me that, look, you are a conservative, you are going nowhere. Okay. And the thing is, I think that has to be taken into account because we know that, especially in the humanities, that overwhelmingly there is a political persuasion that dominates. And I wish I remembered this guy's name, Adam something, the professor at the College of Charleston. You look at his Twitter and there's all kinds of, it's like he's using his position to encourage left-wing activism, which is certainly his right. But, there is a political end game here. To say that my culture, the roots of my culture, is fundamentally, the roots are fundamentally toxic, rather than, it is a wholesome culture with toxic elements, which I think can be said about America as a whole. And let's not pretend that, the autobiography of Malcolm X, not a bit of that happens in the South. And that's another thing that I think that it's very convenient to take this one area of the country and to focus all of our racial evil.
No, that is a totally different conversation.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, and maybe we can have that some other time. But I do think that there are implications. When we talk about the implications of teaching this or that, that if we look at the Confederacy as the axis of evil in the country, never mind that Confederates were advocating for a way of life that had been tolerated for 85 years throughout the United States of America, and that slavery wasn't even illegal until after the war. And in your home state of Kentucky, for example, so I think that to say that there are some nuances, I think it's fair.
I don't think that simple fact of saying that there's nuances is different. Right? Just clarifying everything in history is going to have complexity and nuance to it in some way, shape, or form. But once again, I think that's very different than saying, well, this statue was about, my ancestors and this was about this. And I think it's our responsibility to look at those things and evaluate it and listen to people that are hurt by it. Right? Listen to who it is that it's affecting. Right? Are we, when we're looking at these statues, when we're thinking about the history of the Confederacy, do we side with an institution, a government 150 years ago that more or less tried to create itself, remove itself from the U.S. government, and do that, for a primary purpose for the enslavement of Africans, or chattel slavery? Or are we going to side with people who are Americans today, right? People who are alive and well today and are saying, the memory of this in my face all the time, that is offensive and that is making it difficult for me to be American, right? Who are we going to side with on that? Because I don't think we're getting rid of the history. And I don't know a whole lot of people that would also say that. But again, right, that's who I surround myself with. That's the natural, big sword of America in general. Further anything, the partisanship of where we are right now.
Well, go. Yeah. And I think that that's something, like, for me, I had to be told by, left-wing activists that, the memory of the Confederacy and the Civil War was racist. I mean, when I was growing up watching Dukes of Hazzard, nobody was looking at that car and saying that car is, racist. Ernest goes to jail. One thing, as an interesting historical relic, this is around 1990. There's, a black gentleman and a white gentleman. I mean, they're prisoners. I don't know the extent to which gentleman is appropriate, but, the thing is that they're sitting in this jail cell that they share, and there's a Confederate flag right behind them, and nobody's like, you know what, we may not want that on the set because that's insensitive, and then in the 1990s, I would say that part of the problem is the weaponizing of history, rather than, using history to teach critical thinking, using history as a tool to basically be used to spur political activism, which I think is an approach that a lot now. I know a lot of professional academics who don't do this, and I respect a great deal. But I think that there are some professional academics who are willfully engaged in this kind of thing, that we are using history for this objective. And I think if we were incorporating all perspectives, which, all is a strong word, but, but this is interesting because like we were saying before this talk, I mean, it's not like we're going to be changing anybody's mind here, but, it is a beneficial conversation, because certainly for somebody like me, I've had to think about, let me make sure that I'm incorporating, other perspectives that I may not be prone to, to incorporate naturally.
And like I said, this is some talking to you about this. I don't have a lot of, even in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I don't have a whole lot of students that would take your perspective on this, right? And I think depending on where we live or who we surround ourselves with, we oftentimes don't get to see that other side of that perspective. So that's why I think what we're doing tonight is important, right? It's why it's good for our students to hear things like this, and it's why we need to further spur and encourage that open dialogue within our classrooms. But I want to come back to one thing you said, and think about how you said that you're using history as a weapon. But I want to reiterate again that I think a lot of what we're doing is actually not so much using history as a weapon, but we're looking at a history that for the last 100 years, many people have been doing the same thing. Right. I think that was, that the entire narrative of the lost cause, the entire narrative of states' rights, of praising the gentility of the South, right? That was in many ways using history as a weapon. It was people realizing that if they wrote the books, if the Southern historians controlled the narrative throughout the South, then Southern states would see it as such going forward. And it worked, because now you and I are having this conversation and blaming people today for doing the same thing and saying, well, let's rewrite this and let's get it right this time, and saying they're going to use history as a weapon, when really what I see it as is actually reclaiming it as history and erasing the heritage that has been created around the South.
Okay, and I think that what you say is has a lot of fairness about it, and it's something that I plan to address in a video pretty soon. I think I'm going to put out some Civil War stuff in the near future and try to accelerate that based on where things are going now. But I think that it's like the lost cause was a reactionary historiography. Okay, and we can agree on that. Okay, now what we may not agree on is that I think that the lost cause represents a flawed interpretation of the Civil War. It is not an interpretation, though, that is completely and wholly without merit. You know, it's like, you know, somebody, I mean, the thing is that somebody's going to tell me that, like, oh, don't even open this book because it's a bunch of lost cause propaganda. Okay. And they'll say that this is completely worthless. I mean, you know, I think the president of the Confederacy might know a little bit, you know, the guy that was U.S. Senator, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, I believe, as well. I mean, you know, and the thing is, you don't have to read far to see that in 1860, in February of 1860, Jefferson Davis introduced resolutions in the Senate claiming that, you know, stating that the Constitution was a compact between the states. And the Senate passed this resolution. The House did not. You know, and part of the Civil War, you know, whether it's nullification, whether it's Jefferson Davis's resolutions, whether it's, you know, I mean, there are tons of things here, like when Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun are competing with toast. Like, you can see during nullification that there is disagreement about what the United States is, you know, what the United States is or are. And this disagreement, you know, was something that was a cause of the Civil War, that where is this line between the federal and state governments? You know, I compare this to like Chuck E. Cheese's, you know, where you've got the little gophers that come up, and states' rights, you know, states' rights comes up and they're like, bam, you know, and then they take care of the immediate problem and they never address the issue. And to completely ignore this, I think, is reactionary. You know, there's a reason why this lost cause historiography worked, because there's some truth to it. But then what we've seen, and it's the same methods that are being used today by interest groups, not for just for the Civil War, but for all kinds of topics, that people just want to win. They want their way, and they're unwilling to see that, you know, maybe like, in all of these pages, maybe there is something in here of merit, even though there's going to be other stuff that is without merit. And that's where I think that we are seeing you know, we've gone from like one form of uncritical thinking about the Civil War to another form of uncritical thinking about the Civil War. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah. I think that there might be just yeah, and I see what you're saying then. I think that you can definitely see some form of merit in that understanding of it, right? Is that there are absolutely those that would have us, or have our government itself, kind of rewrite and say this is the way it was, and write a history that would be absolute best for who we are as a nation. But I look at that, you know, the Jefferson Davis text, and I think there's absolutely merit in looking at that. Every source has a bias. That should be, you know, History 101 for our students and talking about it. And it's looking at multiple sources and thinking about who they are and where it's coming from. And that's what we're going to have to continue to do as we go forward, and continue to think about the nuance and the complexity of history. And I think a lot of that starts with these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, you know, this conversation's been a lot less uncomfortable than I expected it to be. You know, because I think that when it comes down to it, there are very few people that, you know, and I think, like you said, I mean, you teach in the research triangle, you know, so there's going to be one way of looking at this. I teach near a major university, you know, so, you know, but you go to other places, and, you know, this is like part of the way they see themselves. I've got a buddy that's a PhD student at the University of Tennessee, and he ran into some guys that were from East Tennessee. He's from Illinois, and they had like Confederate stuff on their thing. And he's like a big fan of the Confederacy for whatever reason. But he was telling these guys, you know, odds are your ancestors fought for the Union. And I'm like, you can't tell them that. And he's like, but wouldn't they want to know? And it's like, well, you know, you're really like, you know, you're you know, this is how these people see themselves. You know, so I think that there are those other perspectives out there that, you know, sometimes have to be considered. But I think that, I mean, where I see this eventually going, either we're all going to tear each other's throats off, you know, over this debate, or I think the next step is some sort of synthesis, you know, that somebody comes up with. You know, is there a way to interpret the Civil War that, you know, allows people to discuss, debate, move on, you know, whatever it is they're trying to do?
Is that what's happening right now? I guess is what I would say, is that, because that's the way I see it, is that this is the necessary growing pains of reinterpreting that like heritage that has been built, and recreating it, and actually getting the history right.
And do you think there's really getting history right? I mean,
Oh yeah,
that's
I
where,
get
you know,
you.
because that's
Yeah.
something for me. I mean, I always emphasize in my classroom the interpretive element of history and the subjective nature of it. So
Yeah.
when I hear stuff like that, when we think about that, it's a little bit of a red flag for me. What do you mean by that? Like when you say getting history right? I mean, you said something earlier that seemed to think, sometimes you can just go ahead and shut the books on it. But what are your thoughts?
I think that there are ultimately, yeah, and I do think there are certain things that absolutely, I think that we can more or less get. Again, there's nuance, there's complexity. It's difficult to say that anything is black and white, everything is in gray. But we should look at certain events as more concrete, and I think that the purpose of the Confederacy, in realizing what the values of the Confederacy and the fact that those don't align with who we are today as a nation, is something that we should recognize. And that doesn't change the fact that the Confederacy was there, doesn't change the fact that we can look at individuals from the Confederacy. But for those, especially like the monuments, people that represent the Confederacy in some way, shape, or form, I think we can make an absolute and clear statement that is getting our history right, that the Confederate States of America does not represent who we are, and their values do not represent us, and therefore we should not be memorializing them in some way.
Well, so on the other hand, here's another question I'd ask you. Like, what about the values of the rest of the United States in the 1860s? That's one thing when I took my family to DC,
Mhm.
and I'm looking up who's this equestrian statue a stone's throw from the White House, and that's William T. Sherman,
Yeah.
and not only, when you look at, what William T. Sherman's army did, and here's the thing too, Parker, that I think is, that is dangerous to me, that when we reduce the Confederacy to only one thing, then I think that what people think is like, what? Those people were fighting for slavery. If their homes got burned, if their women got raped, if their property was stolen, then no problem, because those people were inhuman. And in the United States of America, do we want to teach our own history in a way that promotes the dehumanization of any group of American people? And that to me is really kind of the issue that, and not just what Sherman did during the Civil War, but also what Sherman did out west in the
Yeah.
Native American
Oh,
genocide.
yeah.
Does that represent who we are? Would you support,
Yeah.
like, hey, while we're at it, let's get rid of monuments to William T. Sherman and other people who participated in the Native American genocide?
That's a great question. I guess what I would probably say is that it all comes down to community buy-in, right? In the case of Silent Sam, in the case of, I think, a lot of statues that have come down, including those that came down forcibly, there was huge grassroots. There have been petitions for years, as student activism of the community in some way, attempting to get those statues taken down. And a lot of our history does not represent our values today, right? I would say the past in general, we evolve as a society. What we used to be is not who we are now. And if the people, right, if a community or if a state or local or even federal government makes the decision that we have evolved as a people, if the way that we interpret history has changed on a state, local, federal level in some way, to where that person no longer represents us, yeah, I'm okay with
Well,
taking that down.
Now if you talk about community buy-in, though, what about in North Carolina? The law says that these are protected
Right.
monuments. So if we're really thinking about community buy-in,
Mhm.
then why are we not allowing the democratic process to work out and for this to be done? Because obviously the removal of these monuments does not have widespread popular support in the state of North Carolina, in the sense that it represents, a consensus of people. And I mean, I think that, sure, there are activists out there, but those activists don't they represent a faction. And to claim otherwise, I don't think there's a basis for that. So I'm wondering, if we talk about community buy-in, is it selective? Can we do community buy-in some places and not others?
I think that what happened here was community buy-in. Right? You don't see that happening in the rest of North Carolina, because I think you're right. Most of the state of North Carolina is not interested in taking down those Confederate statues. The two that have come down in the state were in Durham and Chapel Hill, two of the areas on the map that will consistently go blue, that are going to have that more kind of left-leaning perspective towards these statues. And when it comes to the rule of law, I kind of come back to what I said at the beginning, which was they had attempted all forms of democratic processes. And what I often tell my students when I'm teaching, we talk about activism all the time because that's social studies, is that you have to make a decision about what's important to you. And then at the end, you have to make the decision of where your kind of tipping point is. Right? At what point are you willing to risk consequences? And my belief would be that if the community as a whole believes in something, and whoever takes those actions, first and foremost, that aren't harming other people, if they are willing to accept the legal consequences of their action, then the rule of law is still working. Right? If UNC decides to go forward with an inquisition into who it was that's responsible for this, I would hope that the people that did it believed in it enough that they are going to accept the legal consequences for their actions.
Okay, so you have no qualms with whoever was responsible for this illegal act, paying the legal price for what they chose to do.
No. Okay. I think that if they believed in it enough, then yeah, like I said, I support the outcome here, taking down Silent Sam. I wish that we could have gotten more buy-in from the university. Right. I wish that the community in some way had attempted it. Was it the mayor, or not the mayor, the governor, Roy Cooper sent a like pretty clear message to the UNC board last year at some point. I'm trying to think, I can't remember where I saw this, but where he said, like, I know this is the law, but there are these clear loopholes that say if it is dangerous to have this in some way, it can be removed. I think that that's a clear statement that could work for UNC, and the UNC board just kind of ignored that. Right? They chose not to go forward with that. And so there were multiple efforts, both from community members, from students, and even, like I said, from the governor, who told them his intent on why it probably should be moved before something like this happened. And this was the result of a lot of frustration for a lot of people. But yeah, I think they should be willing to accept the legal consequences for their actions.
Now, I think, this actually came from my students when we were discussing this in class, and we looked at the UNC statement, and, you saw the statement, I'm sure, and it was just, it used a lot of different words. Like, it was calculated to kind of try to make as many people happy as possible and to tick off as few people as possible. And, when I was asking about what are the audiences, one of my kids said, the donors. And I was like, whoa, like, I mean, you think about that, there's probably some big donor money at UNC that, is, I mean, there are a lot. And of course, there's the state money, that they have to think about as well, because what kind of consequences will a conservative Republican controlled legislature take on the university or something like that? So, but then I guess I would just ask you kind of rhetorically, but how is this any different than secession? I mean, when we think about, if somebody's going to say, secession is, these people who had tried like all of these methods to get what they wanted, and they finally couldn't get what they wanted, and they decided, what we're going to use, what you would clearly consider extra legal means, which I guess they paid the consequences. But I just think that, in that kind of situation, how's that any different?
I think I agree that it's more a rhetorical question, because I don't think it's that different.
Oh yeah. And so that's, that's fascinating. But I think that, this has been a pretty profitable discussion. Now, just for clarity, if we could go back a week and you knew it was about to happen, and they said, Parker, we're just going to make you like the, we're going to put this in your hands.
Yeah.
So what would you have done?
What would I have done?
Yeah, what would you have said? You get to dictate what's going to happen. Like, the Fossace has been put in your hands, and you get to dictate what's going to happen to this monument, how would you have handled this?
If I could have handled
we
it,
could go back a week,
ooh,
and you
man.
get to do whatever you want with
Yeah.
Silent Sam.
It's still there. What I would do, personally, I don't know if I have a fully developed thought on what I would do, because I don't know. Like, if I had to, I would absolutely have it removed. What happened with it, I'm not sure. I think that there's a room for some monuments to be held in museums and cemeteries. I think Silent Sam would be one of those that could be placed in a Confederate cemetery somewhere as, again, an artifact, but not a monument. And I think more importantly, I would leave the base there empty. And I would put up some form of dedication to slaves that helped build the university, right? Build to the families of those in Chapel Hill, former slaves that lived in the area in some way, so that we can kind of respond and put something up that represents who we are today, right? That represents our checkered past and realizes that, instead of keeping just our past on display. So I would say move it, probably because it wasn't something that was so obviously and glaringly just a Confederate monument, but a monument, yes, in some ways, to Confederate soldiers. I would say a cemetery, a museum, treat it as an artifact somewhere else where we can study it and talk about it. But remove it for sure. Put up some form of other statue that represents who we are today.
Now, first of all, I want to say, like, for people who are still watching, if some of y'all have been watching the whole time, I think what's really something about this, is that you and I clearly have, I mean, and it's not like we're like here and here on the Civil War, probably more like here and here, I mean, it's just there are some minor issues, but I think those minor issues really play a role in how, we perceive things. Like I've said before, I'm not ashamed that my ancestor was a Confederate veteran. I don't think secession was a good idea. I don't think that the Confederacy should be our model for anything like that. But at the same time, if somebody were to ask me, hey, this thing's at risk, what might you do with it? I think it belongs in I'd love to see it in a cemetery, I mean, something like that, as far as, because I think that it pays greater homage to the soldiers. And, I'm raising my daughter who's 8 years old. One time I took her to a reenactment. It's kind of a personal story. I've never really told this in an open forum, but I took her to a reenactment and they gave her a little bag with stuff in it. And, she looks in this bag, and my 6-year-old daughter's like in her car seat, like waving this little Confederate flag. And I didn't even see that in there. And I'm just like, as a parent in the 21st century, I'm like, I mean, what do I do here? Okay. Because I'm, my daughter, I mean, she's just waving it around, and I'm like, I can't let her grow up like that. It's like society is going, I mean, I've got to, she's growing up in the 21st century. So I took her to the cemetery where I filmed the video the other day, and we went to Harry Miller's grave, and I had her put that flag at the base of Harry Miller's grave. And I told her that this is where this flag belongs. This is somebody who died in that war. And, this flag really doesn't have a place outside of this cemetery in the world that we live in today.
I think we're totally in agreement on that.
And the thing is that, for me, it's like, I don't want my daughter to be, I think that we need to be critical about our past, but I also, I'm thankful that I was, born and raised in the South. And I think there's a lot that's wholesome about our culture. But I think that there are things to be regretted too. And I feel like, the celebration of the Confederate soldier is not as much as, just a, and I would use the word monument, but I think it's more of a solemn remembrance that, it's really just like, look, these are people who, came before me, and these people died. And to me, it's just, for me, it goes back to when I was at Arlington Cemetery, and the Confederate cemetery, which is out of the way, but I'd encourage anybody who, is interested in Civil War memory to go look at that monument. That's, the monument that was dedicated during Wilson's presidency. And there are 500 Confederate graves that are surrounding this monument in a circle. And of course, the Confederate graves all have points, they say, so the Yankees don't sit on them, is what they say. But excuse me. I sat down at the base of this monument and I just had this very sudden, like, emotional experience because I considered that there are 500 Confederate graves surrounding me. You know, these 500 soldiers that died in the war, whose remains were transplanted. You know, this is the thing that a lot of people don't talk about is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Like, the Confederates who were buried in the North for a long time, they weren't allowed to beautify the graves. You know, that these people had been lying in these graves just completely untended. And, you know, they bring them over here. But what occurred to me was that multiply this circle of 500 dead people by 1,000, and it's still not enough. And that was when a lot of people have that moment at Arlington Cemetery when they break. And for me, that was that moment. And it's just when I think about the American Civil War, you know, what are the consequences of polarization and not being able to come up with a solution to your problems? And I think that sometimes we forget about, you know, it's not the Holocaust, but certainly a Holocaust in terms of just the massive death. And that's why, you know, I don't want to forget those people and what happened to them. But I think that it's worth saying that, you know, if you and I were to, it wouldn't be hard for you and I to sit down and come up with a solution to this problem, because it is a problem. I mean, it's a problem. And, you know, when we think about that, we can have a discussion and we can pretty much agree on what we do with it, maybe for different reasons. I mean, for me, it would be more of a place of honor. But at the same time, you know, put it somewhere, but not where people have, because I'm not out to offend people. I mean, when I was growing up, you know, in high school, I mean, I had, you know, little, you know, Confederate flag on my keychain, stuff like, I mean, I don't have a flag like that anywhere in my house. You know, but it was different back then. But it's just, you know, I'm not out to offend anybody, and I'm not out to celebrate anything.
It's because we evolve, right? That's
well,
we
exactly.
reinterpret. We realize.
This is what gets to me, Parker, just on a personal level, is I feel like in the last 20 years I've evolved a great deal, and then, you know, I get a message from these, you know, from these extremists that, you know what, I haven't evolved enough. And I still get all kinds of like names thrown at me, you know, just for not repudiating my ancestor service. You know, that I'm seen as some, you know, people have called me a racist and, you know, all of this other stuff, you know, which I don't think that climate is healthy. I think that's the kind of climate that led to, you know, led to the Civil War in the first place. Because, you know, every other country for some reason was able to work out these issues without that amount of bloodshed. But Parker, as we wrap up, you know, you have any closing remarks for us?
Just the importance of these kind of conversations, right? Like, sitting down with somebody that you disagree with, and being able to have a conversation about these controversial issues, I think is just so important. And it's something that we're kind of struggling with, and it's our responsibility, yours and mine, along with all the teachers, but especially history teachers, to develop this skill in our students. Right, like we are funneling kids out with a mediocre understanding of social studies, and no ability to talk to other humans. Right, and I would rather have my kids have a decent at best understanding of social studies, but be able to listen to another person, right? Get their point of view, and even if you disagree with them, be civil with them. Try to understand where they're coming from. Talk about their heritage, their history, who they are, where they're coming from. And so I thank you for the opportunity today. Like this, I think, is, if nothing else, this can model for our students and for other teachers kind of what that looks like, right? Being able to talk to somebody that you disagree with, because it's a skill that so many Americans have lost.
Yeah, and I thank you, Parker. I mean, because that's really, like, I mean, I feel better after this discussion. Like, I feel better about that. Like, I feel like there's been kind of a weight just having this conversation, and especially being willing to have this conversation with an audience, you know, of about 50 people coming in and out. And thanks Logan Durham, who's here, one of my students that I lost to the governor's school. I'm so glad that he's still kind of keeping up with me. There's somebody with a UK Wildcats thing here. One of your buddies is watching there. So thank y'all. And I know that this is a very polarizing issue, and it looks like the chat was pretty interesting, as I would have expected. And but yeah, and Parker, let's stay in touch. I really wouldn't have a problem with perhaps we're only about 4 hours away. Maybe we can drop in on each other's classes. There's some collaboration opportunities here. There's always the internet too, even if
it's a magical place.
I just think I appreciate you coming and offering your perspective. And again, yeah, I think having a model of civility and being able to discuss these things without any kind of name calling and just letting people figure out, and hopefully those of you watching will use this as a platform for further research. That's really, because to me, like I said, my biggest fear is that the study of the American Civil War, people are just going to check out because it's just too, it's just become too controversial. But with that, thank you very much, Parker, he's at Mr. Whitehouse EDU on Twitter, and it's just been great, making this guy's acquaintance. And thank y'all so much for supporting the channel. And I've got a cool little meme video on Napoleon that's not relevant to U.S. history, but folks, I'll be posting that once I get out of here and I can use my internet again, my bandwidth. So y'all stay tuned for that. And thank y'all for supporting my channel and the study of history. And it's always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. Thanks.